Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. for the Institute for Dialectical Metarealism. Let's get rolling. A few months ago, I did two podcast episodes on Piterim A. Sorokin, a man whose ideas dominated my thinking for a long time, but in kind of a contrary way. I spent much of my time trying to, I guess you could say, deconstruct him, although I'm not using that term exactly as it was used by various people, such as Jacques Derrida. I'm using it in a somewhat new way, meaning I was trying to find flaws in his reasoning. That's probably a better way of putting it. And I found many. Um, Sorokin was an anti-communist. Sorokin was a self-defined conservative Christian anarchist, and a lot more than that. Sorokin really despised communism. Saying he was an anti-communist is an understatement. I mean, the guy was arrested by Vladimir Lenin in Russia. He was later released, but only on the condition that he would leave the Soviet Union. And he then came to the US, where he became a professor at Harvard University. So that was basically the recompense that Sorokin got. And for the rest of Sorokin's life, he was basically what we could, I think, easily call a very, very strong anti-communist. So what I wanted to do is to talk about what I did with Sorokin in a more clear fashion than what I did before. I said that I used a kind of post-Marxist approach. That is kind of true, but not really. I was using that term in a very general sense. Really, what I was doing was a kind of Hegelian Marxism. The Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, commonly called critical social theory, was dominated by a great deal of Hegelian Marxism. And my views were in alignment with many of those thinkers. I kind of synthesized them with one another. And so I think that is a better way of expressing my approach that I had to Sorokin than saying that I was a post-Marxist. I was using that in a very general sense, but I realized that that could be easily confusing. And so what I'm going to do is put on my spectacles and read for you a passage from one of my books in which I discuss the concept of Hegelian Marxism and essentially what I did with it in my own personal life and how I used Hegelian Marxism in effect. Um, you should be able to see the screen right now. I will read from As I Moved, and then I will continue about 2.5 paragraphs down, something like that. As I moved from tendency to tendency, and I did, I have continued to recognize until this day some value in each of them. That is true. Embracing a new one has never resulted in a complete rejection of any from the past. Each has contributed to my overall base of knowledge. Below the next few paragraphs is a cursory synopsis of my own Marxist genealogy. I will show you that briefly. It is not what I want to focus on, though. It significantly excludes Roy Bhaskar's critical realism. That subject will instead be taken up in the following chapter. Doing otherwise, chronologically, would be problematic and confusing, beginning with Marxism-Leninism, Maoism, Third Worldism. The first time around, critical realism subsequently became the foundation for the sequence of tendencies in my life as a Marxist. I also accepted international socialism, later left refoundationism, the organization currently called Liberation Road, previously called Freedom Road, a name that it shared with another organization, which is why it changed its name, and then Third Campism. Nevertheless, the tendency with which I identify the longest was Marxism, Leninism, Titoism, an illustration of the ingenious Marxist-Leninist theory of socialism in one country. Some people may disagree that it was that ingenious. Maybe I might disagree with it right now too, but I'm trying to be fair to it. The former Yugoslavia had a self-managing variation of the somewhat problematic market socialism. I was not yet a critical realist. Stalin, a bit like myself at this time, differed with Tito's market socialism. Nevertheless, Stalin tolerated it. Since he proposed socialism in one country, he really had no alternative. During my time as a Titoist, and prior to becoming a Maoist third worldist for the first time, and a critical realist, I proposed my quite innovative, if odd, theory of structural dialectics, an eclectic Hegelian Marxist reconstruction of Peterim Alexandrovich Sorokin's integralism, or originally, as he called it, social and cultural dynamics. That was actually the title of a multi-volume work which he wrote. Thus, to redact Marx's phrase, I turned the socially conservative, morally conservative, and anti-communist integralism on its head. I was also contemplating a Hegelian Marxist critique of Sorokin's conservative Christian anarchy, but critical realism had heretofore eclipsed Hegelian Marxism before that opportunity could present itself. With him, and this is a quotation from Marx, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, the dialectic, is standing on its head. It must be turned right side up again if you would discover the rational kernel within the mystical shell. And so it is based upon that I talked about turning Sorokin upside down on his head. And then a quotation from Andrew Targowski, his Peter A. Sorokin's theory of social and cultural dynamics, or integralism, is a bit like Marx's socioeconomics. However, it was reconfigured to sound different, since he was a staunch anti-communist, as well as someone who had been sentenced to death and later pardoned by Vladimir Lenin. To clarify that, he was only pardoned by him on the condition that he leave the country. So he was pardoned and exiled at the same time. That is not clear from that statement. I will avoid backbiting, slander, or libel, but that is an undeserved favor. By my oblivious or incognizant, if vindictive, reaction to a religious fanatic's, nay, a monster's, emotional abuse, I began to transplant post-structuralism and nominalism into structural dialectics. Pause there for a second. The reason why I referred to what I was doing before as post-Marxism is based upon that, because of the fact that I took post-structuralism and brought it in to what I called structural dialectics, but then I went beyond it. On further reflection, I realized that expressing it that way was misleading because I was never really a post-structuralist. For that matter, I was never really a nominalist. And now I dislike both of them tremendously. And so it is unfair, I think, to people who really are post-structuralists or post-Marxists for me to refer myself to as a post-Marxist. Instead, I think it is more accurate for me to call myself a Hegelian Marxist. Now, having repudiated them both, that's easy for me to say, my personal well-being has been the beneficiary. Since I was admittedly retaliatory by intention, that episode is clearly not one for which I can or should be proud. But being taunted and bullied is no fun. Pause. And that fellow, who I will not name, certainly taunted and bullied me. When I first met him, he was nice to me. He was a salesman type. He had a background in that area. And I realized as I got to know him better that he was far from being a nice man. Far from being a nice man. His actions were also enabled by the owner of the online forum. And I am being deliberately vague in that so that the name of that person is not in what I am saying. Because he viciously and repeatedly attacked me for my contrary understandings of the texts of his favorite writer, I cleverly gave him enough rope to hang himself. Pause. Yes, and I did that over and over again. Now, this guy I thought was an intelligent man, but the fact that he took my rope one time after another, making himself look like a complete fool, made me wonder as to how smart he really was. I basically ruined him, in effect. I ruined his reputation. My intention was not to ruin his reputation. My intention was to stop him from bullying me. But it just turned out that in doing that, I did ruin his reputation, because apparently his reputation was connected in some way with bullying me. And not only me, he was bullying a variety of other people as well. So I felt as though I was standing up for others and not only myself. Ultimately, when I found out that his organization was shut down, and I got the paperwork, surprisingly, from somebody else, who I don't think realized what I would do with it, and I posted that paperwork publicly, which showed exactly what happened to him, and that basically made it impossible for him to return online. Do I regret that? Partially. Partially I do, but not entirely. If I only did it for myself, yes, I would regret it. But I did it not only for me, but for a variety of other people too. And also for the person that this person claimed to represent, because he was giving that person, in my view, a bad name. And I knew that person. That person was certainly not perfect. That person made mistakes too, but nothing like what this guy was doing online. And so, yes, I intentionally brought him down. And everyone saw what I did. It was clear. And as a result, his organization was officially shut down. And I will not say what I mean by that. But he was unable to restart his organization. Oddly, the website for his organization still exists. I don't understand that, but the organization itself no longer exists. At one point, I was on the board of trustees of that organization, but only for a year. I was openly critical of certain aspects of what that organization was doing. From one perspective, there was somebody else on the board who was critical of it from an entirely different, and I would say even opposite perspective. Neither of us were reelected onto the board, in spite of the fact that both of us had entirely different reasons for opposing what that organization was doing. This other person supported this individual who was attacking me. At least he did at the time. I don't know what his views are now. I haven't discussed it with him. Let me continue with what I wrote. I realized sometime later that I only adopted post-structuralism and nominalism perspectives which I would ordinarily eschew to agitate him. And again, was that intentional? No. But I only realized that afterwards, because he was badgering me so much about the fact that I was not, in his view, correctly representing his teacher's views. And in my view, he was incorrect, but also in some respects, his teacher was incorrect as well, in my view, and also in the view of the body that shut his organization down. So it wasn't only my view. But regardless, yeah, I mean, I certainly recognize that my perspectives were flawed, and as a result of my experiences, I completely threw both post-structuralism and nominalism into the trash. I guess you could say I did an underlaboring, a Lockean underlaboring on this person's work. And I found that her work had certain flaws in it that I needed to put literally into the trash. And I won't get any more specific than that. As an autistic, similar incidents have unfortunately dotted my entire life. My conclusion is that I must look or act autistic. My eyes may be a part of it. Whatever the reason, people who target me these days are in for a surprise. I can be both assertive and, through righteous indignation, aggressive. I will read this one final paragraph, and that'll be the end of my reading portion. Having grown up in New York City, I often feel like someone watching a Broadway show from the balcony. I can see the characters and listen to their conversations, but sitting in the audience, I am an outsider. Throughout my life, I have worked to get along with everyone. When I was in graduate school, I befriended professors who despised one another. I did not do that as a tactic. My inclusive method of relationality was spontaneous. For those so inclined, I recommend it. In the end, however, that method usually worked to my advantage. I had no enemies. Time and again, my sociology, which has trained me to be a careful observer, compensated for my autism. I watch those around me closely. Many people have over the years tried to take advantage of me. As I just suggested, although they may see the autism in my sometimes odd facial expressions, they do not see the real me. Consequently, as an adult, not as a child, but as an adult, these bullies have repeatedly failed. If they were more observant and could see beyond outward appearances, I suspect they would hesitate before giving me a hard time. I said that I would show you that diagram, and here it is. This is the diagram I was referring to. This is my my Marxist genealogy, which is really not that relevant to this episode, but here it is, where I started with the New Left, went into Titoism, and Maoism, Third Worldism, and the International Socialism of Tony Cliff, and then Maoism, Third Worldism, then Third Campism, especially for me as it was used by Hal Draper, and then a return to Maoism, Third Worldism. That basically encompasses my my intellectual Marxist journey. And so that is pretty much what I wanted to read in terms of that. The basic point I'm trying to make here is that by turning to Hegelian Marxism, I tried to understand Sorokin in a different way than other people had in the past. In other words, I embraced Sorokin. I loved Sorokin, but not for the reason that most people think. I embraced Sorokin to attack him, not attack him as an ordinary person would say. I mean to intellectually attack him. Maybe a better word would be to critique him. And I did that using Hegelian Marxism, using critical social theory. I basically showed the flaws in Piterim A. Sorokin's reasoning, and I demonstrated why Sorokin's approach to sociology, and he was one of the earliest sociologists in the United States, one of the most preeminent sociologists, and an early president, if controversial, of the American Sociological Association. A lot of people did not like it when he was elected to that body, but he was. After his time, sociology went in a very different direction, a left-wing direction. And so the direction taken by Sorokin, by Talcott Parsons and others, was basically abandoned. And so, for all intents and purposes, Sorokin and Parsons themselves were abandoned. With the rise of the New Left, as new leftists increasingly went into sociology in grad school, I was kind of at the end of that chain. I was not in the initial period of that. I was at the tail end of it, I guess, because I became a new leftist in 1968, but I was only 12 years old. I didn't start college until I was 18 in 1974. So that was considerably later, but still, I was a part of the New Left. The New Left arguably did not end until the end of the new communist movement, which included the Black Panthers, in approximately the year 1985. And so that was basically what I attempted to do, to take Sorokin, to tear his ideas apart, and I guess you could say to deconstruct him, which is also why I thought that it might be appropriate to say that what I was doing was a kind of post-Marxism, but on reconsideration, again, I realized that was misleading. Better to say that my approach was Hegelian Marxist. That is clearer, because ultimately, I rejected post-structuralism before I rejected Hegelian Marxism. And then when I rejected Hegelian Marxism, it was because I encountered the critical realism of Roy Bhaskar. And to this day, in 2024, I have remained a critical realist, and I will always be grateful for the work of critical realism and for the fact that, in my view, Roy Bhaskar rescued me from Hegelian Marxism. Not that I feel a need to attack Hegelian Marxists. There is a lot in Hegelian Marxism I respect, but there are a lot of limitations in it as well. And Roy Bhaskar has compensated for those limitations. And that is what I love about him. And so what I would say is that if you are not familiar with critical realism, read my book, Eudaimonic Utopia. It is linked in the discussion section below this video. You will gain more information on it from reading that book. I think it is better, perhaps, than reading the works of Roy Bhaskar himself, since at least sometimes, not always, Roy can be a difficult read. But I think beginning with my own approach to critical realism, which I start in the second chapter of that book, will provide you with a clearer introduction to the basic ideas of critical realism. For the time being, this has been Mark, by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Meta-Realism. Have a pleasant day, and an even better day tomorrow.